everyone. So we are moving on to chapter 4, which is threats to biodiversity. So we've talked about what is biodiversity, we've talked about the value of biodiversity, and now we're going to talk about all the different things that can threaten biodiversity. And this is kind of one of the parts of the class that's maybe less inspiring because we're talking about a lot of things that hurt plants and animals and other organisms that are resultant from human industry and just all different things that people do. If you've taken BISC and SC 211, the Introduction to Environmental Science, some of this stuff will be a review. Some of this may be a review of things that you already know, so we're going to get to things like climate change, and probably most of you know the basics of climate change, but we're going to go into a lot more detail than you probably have gotten in most other classes except for maybe 211. So major threats to biodiversity, habitat loss, which includes habitat destruction, fragmentation, and degradation, which includes pollution. Global climate change, overexploitation, which includes things like overfishing, overhunting, but it also includes plants, so overharvesting, invasive species, disease, and I did want to go back to the beginning of the class and have you think about what are the ultimate causes of all of these things above. Hopefully you just thought about the number of people on the planet and the amount of resources those people need. Those two things combined contribute to all of these things. There is a third thing that we didn't really talk about, and that's globalization. So how connected our economies are and how much we move people and goods all around the world also affects these things as well. So it's possible that we could use the same amount of resources and have the same amount of people with less globalization, and some of these impacts might be lessened. However, probably part of the reason that we use so many resources is partly because of globalization, because we're able to move goods and services all around the globe very easily and relatively cheaply. So causes of lost biodiversity, you can see this is kind of a diagram that puts them all into context. And so at the top we have increasing human population and consumption. And what's necessary for this large human population and the amount of consumption that we currently do are ecological footprints, are agriculture, logging, fisheries. Right now, our economy is based on fossil fuel use, but also industry, urbanization and road construction, and international trade. And you can see that some of these things lead to habitat destruction, fragmentation, and degradation. Some of these are more closely related to overexploitation. The international trade part we'll get into with invasive species and disease. And then the fossil fuel use, but also agriculture and lots of other industries relate to climate change. And all of these things lead to loss of biodiversity. So we see things like extinction of species and population, degradation of ecosystems, we lose genetic diversity and evolutionary potential, loss of ecosystem services, which are all those values of biodiversity that we just finished talking about, and the erosion of the support systems for human societies. So all of these things are related and they feed back on one another. So we see that as some of these things happen, sometimes we get more invasive species and disease or more habitat degradation, things like that. So they're not necessarily only one way. As we lose biodiversity, sometimes that changes climate change, habitats, and invasive species and disease. So there are feedbacks among these different factors. So I just mentioned what the large categories of all the threats to biodiversity. Which of them do you think is the greatest? It turns out to be habitat loss and degradation. And so you can see this is just a few different groups of organisms. We have mammals, birds, amphibians, and gymnosperms, which are like cone-bearing plants. And you can see for all four of these things, habitat loss and degradation affects the most species in each one of these groups. Now, not every species is habitat the biggest problem, but it is the most commonly occurring problem. And you can see that 80% of threatened species are affected by habitat loss in all of these groups. And then when you look at the secondary ones, it changes depending on what types of species you're talking about. So for mammals, we see that there is a lot of problems from overexploitation and intrinsic factors, which we'll talk about. These are characteristics of species that make them more susceptible to extinction. Birds, overexploitation, and invasive species are the second and third largest. For amphibians, you actually get some different things like pollution. Disease is a really big problem for amphibians, and we'll talk about that. And then for gymnosperms, you can see overexploitation and intrinsic factors. Interestingly, they're pretty similar to mammals. Most species are, in fact, impacted by more than one threat. And this tells you a little bit more about those intrinsic factors. Some different characteristics of species make them more susceptible to extinction. And these are like life history, how well they can move, how long they live, things like that. So, human disturbance. We're going to talk about habitat here. About 53.5% of the Earth's surface has been modified by people. And you can see this on this world map. This is focused on land, not oceans. And so we can see the purple is domesticated land. That means human dominated. And you can see that a lot of the other biomes that we see a lot of are things we don't use a whole lot. So deserts are the big kind of orange areas. Not that great for people. White is ice. We don't use those a lot. Tundra is the light green that you see kind of at the top. And there's some grassland and savanna left and some forest left, but mostly in places that are very cold. So we have a lot of boreal forests left. There's lower population density in those areas. And then there's still some tropical rainforest, tropical dry forest left around the equator. Agriculture is one of the biggest reasons that habitat has been transformed into something more human dominated because we need to eat. And so you can see that at least these colors are where at least 30% of the landscape is cultivated. So if you broke this down into little squares and you added up all the agricultural land, at least 30% would be cultivated. And we've seen that almost all of the land that's suitable for agriculture has been transformed already. So 98% of that land is being used for agriculture. And agriculture does particularly well in areas that used to be grassland and that used to be forest. And you can see the big places where we don't have a lot of agriculture are, again, places where people don't like to live, or it's harder for people to live. So we see the big deserts are blank spots on the map. We see mountains are not great places for agriculture. And we see the Arctic, places that are very cold, don't grow our crops very well. So this shows, if we break it down by different types of ecosystems, habitat lost from the past and projected into the future. So we can see here what's been lost by 1950. The green is what was lost between 1950 and 1990, and the darker red is what's projected to be lost by 2050. And so we can see up here the things that we lost a lot of a long time ago include Mediterranean forest, woodland, and scrub, temperate forests, steppe and woodland, temperate broadleaf and mixed forests, and tropical and subtropical dry broadleaf forests. We've lost a lot of those. Things that are flooded, we've lost less of. And then as we go down, we get to things that aren't that great for people to turn into agriculture and other things like boreal forest and tundra. Even deserts have been used quite a bit, and you can see where loss is projected to continue by 2050. So the biggest one we see is here, the tropical and subtropical coniferous forest. And then we see some other chunks here in tropical grasslands, tropical and subtropical dry broadleaf forests, montane grasslands, and then tropical and subtropical moist broadleaf forests. So you notice a pattern here. We're expecting a lot more habitat loss in tropical areas, which we talked about already have a lot of biodiversity. So that's potentially going to be problematic. So this is where the past losses were the highest, and these are where the future losses will be the highest. And this one I want to point out is the tropical rainforest. And part of the reason that more of it isn't projected is that some of these areas do flood. The Amazon comes out of its basin every year, the actual river, and floods the forest. And so some parts of the forest would be difficult to farm because of the amount of water that's there sometimes of the year. And then, so tropical forest, and then also grassland and shrubland savanna. This shows a similar idea, but it has dots showing what's strictly protected. And you can see that if you look at all these different groups, they tend to have a very small proportion that's strictly protected. And things that are a development risk, you can see some of these are quite high. So endangered habitats, we just talked about tropical forest, big thing that's going to be converted into different types of agriculture, both for livestock and for crops. So this shows some tropical dry forests, some tropical rainforest, but we know that these hold high amounts of biodiversity. So this map shows in green the remaining tropical forest, red is cleared tropical forest, and blue are other types of biodiversity hotspots. And so you can see that a lot of the red is on border on large parts of remaining tropical forest. So we can see the Amazon here, bordering a lot of it is cleared tropical forest. And you can see that there's also some areas going into the Amazon here. A lot of Central America rainforest has already been cleared. A lot of the Asian rainforests have already been cleared. Interestingly, the Australian rainforests aren't even really on this map. Madagascar over here has very unique plants and animals. A lot of it has been cleared as well. So tropical rainforests make up about 7% of the land on Earth and greater than 50% of Earth's species. So we talked about this already. Tropical rainforests are really, really important. And we can see some pictures of tropical rainforest being depleted. I'd like you to look at this picture and see if anybody recognizes what this is. It's actually a palm oil plantation, and palm oil is in almost everything. But in tropical Pacific islands, most of the rainforest destruction is to have these palm oil plantations. We can see here, this is in the Amazon, and they're cutting down the rainforest, burning the timber so that they can have subsistence agriculture. And then we can also see the stark contrast here of where they've cut down rainforest and then there's some left here. So interesting, we can see this shows kind of a time series. So we have 1985 here, and these dark pink colors are recently burned areas in Brazil. And so this is 1985 and this is 2001, and you can see just the amount of areas have increased burning. So interestingly, rainforest, almost all of the nutrients are in the plants. And when you clear the plants, there's not a lot of nutrients in the soil. It's so biodiverse that they're really good at pulling out all the nutrients and incorporating them into plants and animals. So after you clear a tropical rainforest, the soils are depleted very quickly, and so it's actually not that great for agriculture because it's not very fertile soil. So agricultural threats to tropical rainforests, shifting cultivation. So slash and burn is what a lot of people think of, this kind of subsistence agriculture here. Palm oil plantations right here, and that's used for biofuel and for food, but also lots and lots of products. There is some logging. Cattle ranching makes up a big proportion where they clear the rainforest so that they can have places to graze cattle. And then in some areas, particularly in Africa, some of it's for small farms where populations are expanding. So this shows causes of tropical deforestation from 2000 to 2005. And what you'll probably be surprised by is that logging makes up such a small percentage. Logging is not really a huge cause of tropical deforestation. Obviously, the trees are cut down for any use, but they're not cut down just for the timber typically. Most of it is actually cattle ranching. So in the Amazon, the biggest pressure to the Amazon tropical rainforest is cattle ranching by far. So cheap beef and inexpensive beef in Brazil is leading to the destruction and the extinction of many, many tropical species. We see here that small-scale agriculture that people need to survive for food does make up a large chunk, but also large-scale agriculture, and this is where palm oil, but also things like soy and corn and rice are also included. This also shows kind of the patterns of Amazon deforestation, and so this shows 1975, and this shows 2012. And a lot of times you see that the deforestation occurs along roads, which is why they make these weird bands. So somebody builds a road, and then there's lots of deforestation that happens off of that road. And then another road is built, and the same thing happens. The purple areas are cities or small towns, and that's where people use as bases to go and start deforesting these different areas. This shows some more pictures where you can see again this pattern where clearly someone has built a road and then deforestation occurs along that road. And typically that's what happens is first a road is built and people are like, well, that's not a big deal. It's just a road. But then that's where deforestation happens from, is these roads that are built into the rainforest. You can see that cows are often put to graze very, very rapidly after the trees are taken down. So you can see up here that the fires are still burning to take the trees out and get rid of the piles of timber, and they've already put cows out. And so that's a big part of the Amazon deforestation.